Ron thought his past was behind him until a meeting with former colleagues opened up old wounds and turned his life around. Unexpected betrayal, confused feelings, and the cruel truth forced him to reconsider everything he knew about love, trust, and his own family. I wiped away the tears as we turned to leave the gravesite service. The attendance was minimal: my wife, Marlene, my daughter, a longtime friend, and 2 officials. My son had refused to come. Marlene took my arm, pulled me close, and softly said, "I know it's hard when it's someone you love," before kissing me on the cheek. I corrected her. "Sweetheart, the right word is loved, in the past tense. Right now I'm just feeling so sorrowful about what happened and how much she suffered during the past year. You're the one I love. Thank you for your support, and especially for the extra love you've shown over the last few months." The final chapter of a past chapter of my life had just been written and closed. The first chapter began 17 years ago when I married her, Cindy. The closing chapters began 11 years ago when we traveled to the nation's capital for a reunion of the 1st Marine Air Wing. I had resigned from my commission 10 years prior, and one of my close friends, Jerry, did a lot of the groundwork to organize a gathering of our Marine buddies. Most of us had gone through flight training together and served side by side during the first 4 or 5 years of our careers. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you a little more about Cindy and me. My name is Ronald, but everyone calls me Ron Alran. Cindy and I met at the Marine Corps birthday party while I was stationed in Washington. We dated and married 6 months later. We adopted a modified version of an open marriage. I did this thinking it might give her some relief when I was gone for extended periods, like when I was aboard an aircraft carrier for 6 months or more. We agreed to be honest with each other, letting the other know about any extramarital activities, preferably in advance, and we agreed never to engage with anyone we knew in any way. Naturally, we always practiced safe intimacy. It turned out that the need for an open marriage didn't last long. 2 years after we married, I was in a car accident and suffered an eye injury. The injury couldn't be corrected to naval flying standards, and I was reassigned to desk duty. Before the accident, I had been deployed only once for 8 months, and Cindy had exercised her freedom twice, while I had only done so once. I could only tolerate the non-flying administrative role for about 2 years. I was never assigned to a deployment again. So, after just over 2 years at a desk, I quit in frustration at being unable to fly anything other than paperwork. We were approaching our 5th anniversary when I resigned. Our daughter was born shortly after my accident, and our son came along 2 years later. I secured a solid job with an airport planning and construction company based in St. Louis. Alongside my administrative duties, I earned the qualification to pilot the company jet. I flew about twice a month, typically for just 1 or 2 nights at a time. It wasn't quite like flying a fighter, but it was flying, and that made me happy. After returning from my last deployment with the Marines, neither of us felt the need to use the terms of our open marriage agreement. We didn't need it since we were mostly together, with only a few brief separations. When Jerry, the organizer, told me about the reunion, I was thrilled. I shared the news with Cindy, and she was almost as excited as I was. When I asked my boss for a couple of days off, he was more than happy to approve it and planned to go to Washington that Friday on business. He suggested I fly out with Cindy in the company jet, and while he took the weekend to catch up with friends, we'd fly back on Monday. My only expenses would be for lodging, meals, and transport while in Washington. Cindy and I arrived at the hotel around noon on Friday. The reunion didn't begin until Saturday, with lunch followed by a banquet and dancing that night. Smaller groups like ours typically arranged additional meetups or activities on Sunday. I managed to find Jerry and a few other friends and their wives, and we had dinner together. Cindy knew Jerry and his wife and was familiar with Carl, but had never met his wife. We all had a fantastic evening, especially when Jerry got us tickets for a concert at the Kennedy Center. On Saturday, Cindy and I slept in, had a late breakfast, and then joined others for the opening lunch. Afterward, the men gathered in small groups to reminisce about the past. There were many vendors displaying military-related items, and I spent time with 5 of my closest friends, swapping stories. Cindy, along with a few other wives, excused herself and went to the Smithsonian. They came back around 5 p.m., and we all went to our rooms to relax, change, and return for the banquet at 7. Our guest speaker that evening was a retired colonel who had served under Chesty Puller. He kept us riveted to our seats as he recounted Chesty's career. While much of it was serious, it was also filled with funny and entertaining anecdotes, especially when he shared some of his own stories. The formal proceedings wrapped up around 9, and the band took over. I was more focused on chatting with my old friends while Cindy was eager to dance. Eventually, she told me she was going to find a dance partner or two, and that I could talk as much as I wanted. That was fine with me, and honestly, I almost forgot about her. About an hour later, I got the shock of my life when Cindy suddenly appeared from the dance floor. She leaned in close and whispered, "Sweetie, I'm going to be gone for a little while." It took me a moment for her words to sink in. Then, in disbelief, I asked, "Where are you going? What are you doing?" She took me by the arm and pulled me away from the group. "I found someone interesting. I won't be gone long." That's when the full realization hit me. She was about to exercise our open marriage. I had assumed, after leaving the service, that chapter of our life was closed. I just stood there, stunned, staring at her with my mouth open. She gave me a gentle pat on the cheek, and in a light-hearted tone, reassured me that she wouldn't be gone for too long. Before I could respond, she slipped away into the crowd on the dance floor. I tried to follow, but she was already gone. My mind was racing as I processed what was happening. We hadn't talked about our arrangement in years. I'd pretty much written it off as a thing of the past. But now Cindy seemed to be bringing it back into play. I had to admit, since we hadn't officially ended our agreement, she was well within her rights. But when we made that pact, I never imagined it would come up again, especially while we were together or only briefly apart. My thoughts were interrupted when one of the guys asked if I was coming back. I rejoined the group and tried to engage, but my mind wasn't in it. After a while, 2 of my closer friends, who had noticed something was off, began to probe. It didn't take long before I had confessed what was going on. This put a damper on the conversation, and a heavy silence fell over us for a few minutes. One of the guys, trying to lighten the mood and get the conversation back on track, casually said, "Well, at least it isn't with good old Larry Martin." A few people chuckled and agreed, but I didn't find it funny. Larry had been part of our squadron in flight school and stayed around for about 2 years after. I couldn't stand him. He was confident, a blonde pilot who knew he had the looks to match. We used to joke about his overwhelming confidence and how he always seemed to push boundaries. In our first year after flight school, he faced disciplinary issues that eventually led to his decision to resign his commission to avoid formal charges of conduct unbecoming an officer. My unease only deepened when Jerry pulled me aside to inform me that Larry was at the reunion. It worsened when he added that he had seen Cindy talking with him earlier. He quickly apologized, assuming I had already noticed. "Jerry, you think I'd just stay calm if I knew he was here and with Cindy? Do you know where he is?" "Take it easy, Ron. Let's not jump to conclusions. No, I don't know his room number, but the front desk won't tell you that. They might connect you to his room, though. Let's ask around and see who knows." It took a little while, but I finally found Marv, one of the few who still kept in touch with Larry. He provided the room number. By then, about half an hour had passed since Cindy had stepped out. I gestured to Jerry that I was leaving, and by the time I reached the lobby, some of my friends had gathered, ready to make sure I stayed calm. They kept urging me to stay level-headed and not do anything reckless. As the elevator doors opened, I was about to rush inside when I froze, stunned. There was Cindy, stepping out into the lobby. Her appearance was composed, her hair neat and her makeup touched up. I reached for her hand and my friend stepped back to give us space. Standing aside, I asked, "Where have you been?" She looked a bit surprised but answered with slight irritation, "I told you, Ron. I met someone interesting and we talked. Why are you so upset? I haven't done anything wrong." "Was it Larry Martin in room 1021? Her expression shifted, revealing everything I needed to know without a word. I took a deep breath, trying to collect myself. "Let's go upstairs and talk." Cindy was visibly unsettled as I guided her back to our room. Once inside, I shut the door, fighting to keep my emotions in check. When I finally spoke, my voice trembled. "Cindy, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make this into something more than it is. Let's take a moment to clear our heads." She sat down, wiping her eyes and nodding. "I'm sorry for whatever I did to upset you." We sat in silence for a few minutes. Cindy went to the bathroom to wash her face and grab some tissues. When she returned, she sat in my lap and asked if we could talk now. I nodded. "Ron, can you explain what's going on? I thought we had an understanding shortly after we got married. You've never reacted like this before. Please, tell me what I did wrong." "Sweetheart, I'm sorry for my behavior. The first issue is something I caused, or rather, failed to address. I had assumed that our agreement was only necessary when I was deployed for months at a time. After leaving the Corps, I just thought we didn't need that arrangement anymore. I'm sorry, that was a mistake on my part for not discussing it and making things clear long ago." "Oh, darling, I'm sorry too. We should have talked about it. But honestly, tonight was the first time I felt the desire to be with someone else, just for a little while. I see where we misunderstood each other, and I'm happy to cancel that agreement right now." "Okay, we can settle that later, but for now, I need to know. Did you know that I served with him early in my military career before I met you?" Her face drained of color, and I could tell I had struck a nerve. "Oh, honey, I'm sorry. He's a really nice guy and great to be around. He's had a tough life, and I admire him for everything he's accomplished. I think—" "Damn it, Cindy, just answer my question. Did you know we knew each other?" There was a long pause, and she was trembling. "Yes, I knew. But I was afraid. I don't care about what you were afraid of. Our agreement was clear. We wouldn't get involved with anyone we both knew. Now, I think you understand why I insisted that be part of our arrangement. Honestly, right now, I don't think that condition was really necessary. Larry is a wonderful man, and I enjoyed his company. That was too much for me." I stood up abruptly. "You just don't get it, do you? That person, if I'd thought about it back then, is exactly why I insisted on no close connections. And now you're just sitting there, listening to me talk about him." I explained how he'd faced consequences during his time in the Corps. I mentioned that during his second issue with a medical condition, it turned out the general's daughter, whom he had been seeing, was also affected. I admitted that it wasn't clear who was responsible. Then, in an attempt to lighten the situation, I said, "I guess you could even be thankful to him. He interfered in my past relationships, and because of that, I was still single when we met." That would have been fine, but I added, "Now, he's somehow managed to disrupt every relationship I've had." Cindy sat there for a moment, motionless. I could see her processing what I'd said. Then she gave a soft smile and said, "Rob, this is all just because you're holding on to the past." I felt my frustration rise. You have to admire someone to be jealous. There's nothing admirable about him. I don't know what he told you, but most of it was probably just a ploy to win sympathy." She winced slightly, but then composed herself and suggested we take a break and join the group downstairs. She stood up, grabbed her purse, and went to the bathroom. A few moments later, she returned, looking composed. "Put your coat on, and let's go. Let's try to enjoy the rest of the evening. I'm sorry for everything. I'm not going back down there. For me, the evening is over." "Well, I'd like to go back and say goodbye to our friends. Here's the thing. If I go and I see him, it won't end well. I'm not saying you can't go, but if we do, there might be trouble. It's your choice." She sighed. "Ron, let's not overthink it. We can still enjoy the time we have left." I looked at her and spoke seriously. My tone made it clear I meant every word. She stared at me for a moment before smiling. "Well, maybe we could just relax and talk things over." That's when I surprised her. "I love you, and I'm sorry for all that's happened, but we need to make sure everything is right before moving forward." She looked at me, stunned. "You must be joking. Everything's fine." "Let's just be sure," I replied. She turned away, visibly hurt. I regretted that the situation had reached this point, but the frustration and pain were difficult to manage. I called my boss to let him know our plans had changed and that we could leave in the morning if he preferred. He agreed, and we arranged to meet at the airport at 9. Afterward, I called Jerry and let him know we'd be leaving. He expressed concern and asked if we were okay. I gave him a brief summary, and he invited us to join them for one last drink and breakfast the next morning. I agreed, and Cindy and I returned to the reunion. When we rejoined Jerry and his wife, I noticed that most of the guests were still there, but a few had stepped out for a break. Jerry said, "Looks like they all went for a quick break at the same time. They'll be back soon." And sure enough, they returned shortly, looking cheerful. Jerry gave me a reassuring smile. We had our drinks, said our goodbyes, and returned to our room. We'd only been there for a few minutes when the phone rang. It was Jerry, telling me that Larry had apparently fallen down a flight of stairs and had been taken to the hospital. The initial report said he'd be there for a day or two. I couldn't help but smile and thank him for the good news. After hanging up, it hit me. I remembered hearing sirens near the hotel shortly after the guys returned from their break. Now it all made sense, the smiles and the hand signals. I almost burst out laughing. Cindy asked what was so funny and why I was so happy. I told her, and she gasped, saying we should stop by to see him before leaving in the morning. That was enough for me. "Cindy, you've known me for almost 15 years. You spent nearly 5 of those years with me as a Marine, and you know that Marines take care of each other." She interrupted, "But Larry is a Marine." I raised my voice. "Not by our definition. But if you want to call him a Marine, let me put it in terms you'll understand. If you want a peaceful life, don't mess with Marines, especially if you're one yourself." Tears in her eyes, she turned towards the bathroom, saying, "Ron, I'm so ashamed and disappointed in you." I shrugged. "That bastard can take care of himself. He doesn't need your sympathy, and he certainly doesn't get any from me. If I have to visit him, I'll make sure to break something that isn't already broken. He couldn't have deserved it more." When we got back home, we kept our distance for a few days. The main reason for this was my insistence that she get checked before we were intimate again. She had the checkup and got a clean bill of health on Tuesday. Since I had insisted and the results were negative, Cindy responded with an, "I told you so." That was her way of showing that she hadn't forgiven me yet. It wasn't until Thursday night that we finally got around to discussing our arrangement. I was both surprised and disappointed when Cindy insisted that we keep the agreement as it was. I eventually agreed after we added a clarification and a new clause. The clarification was this: before either of us exercised the freedoms allowed in the agreement, We would inform the other in advance, even if it was just a few minutes beforehand. The added clause stated that the informed partner could exercise a veto, and there would be no discussion. The veto would override any other terms of the agreement. Just as we were starting to get things back to normal, I made another mistake that delayed the healing of our relationship for a couple of weeks. Cindy wasn't content to let things go and kept raising issues that challenged my view of Larry or tried to justify her feelings toward him. It wasn't constant, but it came up several times during the first couple of weeks at home. I was tired of hearing about Larry and was growing frustrated that he kept coming up in our conversations. One evening, after the kids were in bed, she brought him up again. It had been a rough day, and I was exhausted. When Larry came up again, I snapped and said he was someone who didn't deserve the attention we were giving him. Cindy immediately tried to defend him, and I told her, "Cindy, please, just let it go. We don't need to keep talking about him." "Ron, I don't understand why you have to be so stubborn. He deserves more respect than you're willing to give him." Then, I said something out of frustration. "Cindy, the only reason you're defending him is because you want to believe he has redeeming qualities. He's not worth the energy we're spending on this." She responded angrily, "Ron, I never knew you could be so harsh with your words." Pushing too far, I added, "Well, was it really worth all this drama?" She stormed out of the room, and we didn't speak for several days. However, this last exchange seemed to have brought an end to the topic. I didn't hear about Larry again. Things settled down, and everything was fine for about 3 months. Then, things began to change, though at the time the changes seemed minor. It had been about 3 months since our reunion when some friends from Washington, where we used to live, were passing through town. They called me shortly after I arrived at work and asked if Cindy and I could join them for dinner that evening. I thought it was odd that they had contacted me at work instead of calling Cindy at home. I finished up what I was doing and called Cindy to let her know. She didn't answer. I waited and tried again about an hour later, but still no response. It seemed strange to me because we always kept each other informed about our whereabouts. If she had just run to the store, she would have been back by now. I went home for lunch, as I usually do. Cindy was there, and when I asked her where she had been that morning, she apologized and said she had to go to the department store for something. I don't remember what it was now. However, I noticed a slight flush in her face when she answered, and I could tell something was off. Our friends had left a message on the answering machine, but either she didn't take the time to listen to it, or she didn't have the time. I had a strange feeling that she hadn't been home much longer than I had. Nothing unusual happened for the next 5 or 6 weeks. Then, one evening when I returned from work, I picked up a receipt from the floor near the garage door. It had clearly been dropped by Cindy. I glanced at it quickly and was about to continue into the house when something made me stop. I took a second look, and it registered. It was a parking receipt from the Sheraton Hotel. I studied it a bit longer and saw that it had been issued at 11:15 that morning, with a charge for over 2 hours. She hadn't mentioned going anywhere that day, and I remembered she had asked if we'd be having lunch together. I had told her I'd be with a client. Now my mind was racing. The Sheraton was no more than 20 minutes away, so if I had changed my lunch plans, she would have been back by then. Something didn't feel right. When I walked in, she was finishing up with dinner preparations and greeted me with a bright smile and a big kiss. I didn't mention the receipt while we were eating. Instead, I casually asked the kids about their day, and as usual, they gave me a detailed account of everything they had been doing. Then I turned to Cindy and asked how her day had gone. She said it had been fine. When I asked her what she had done, she looked down, and I sensed some hesitation in her response. She mentioned a few things she had done, the usual routine, but never once mentioned leaving the house. After the kids went to bed, she told me she was really tired and was heading to bed herself. I thought about joining her, but something didn't feel right. She was hiding something. I started to suspect what it might be, but I didn't want to say anything that might be wrong or out of place, so I decided to just watch some TV for a while. I felt uneasy, but a parking receipt didn't seem like much of a lead. Over the next week or two, the issue faded, and I pushed it out of my mind, until one night when I was going through the bills. I've always managed our finances. I keep Cindy in the loop and involve her from time to time. I don't want her to be uninformed in case anything ever happens to me. Normally, I skim through the bills, but only look at them closely if something seems out of the ordinary. Her cell phone statement usually shows a list of local calls, with the occasional 800 number long-distance call. Rarely, there will be an incoming long-distance call. But this time, as I was scanning through, my eyes stopped on 3 incoming and 2 outgoing calls to the 414 area code. All of them were late afternoon calls, all were to and from the same number, and all took place over the span of about a week, just before the statement closed, about a week ago. It seemed odd. I grabbed the phone book and searched for area code 414. When I found it, a chill ran through me. Milwaukee, Larry's city. What the hell was going on? Cindy was out of earshot, so I picked up the phone and dialed the number. Just as it was about to ring, I hung up. If it was Larry's phone and he had caller ID, he'd know where the call was coming from. I went to the bedroom to grab my cell phone, which has a blocked caller ID. I dialed the number again. The voice that answered was unmistakably Larry's. I disguised my voice and pretended to be calling from the Police Benevolent Association. I asked just enough questions to confirm that it was really him. I had to fight the urge to storm into the living room and confront Cindy. Instead, I sat for a few minutes, feeling sick to my stomach. Eventually, I managed to collect myself and start thinking rationally about what I needed to do. The first thing I did was pull out the phone statements from the months since the reunion. One statement showed an outgoing call and an incoming call to Larry about a month after the reunion. I must have missed them because there were only 2 calls, separated by 5 others. On the next statement, there was just 1 call. But the following statement had 3 calls, 1 clearly linked to the previous call, and 2 more near the end of the period. It was all very interesting, but what did it mean? And what was I supposed to do with this information? When I began to put the pieces together, a wave of nausea hit me. Her unexplained absences, the calls, her defense of him. Were they having an affair? But when? Where and how? Larry wasn't supposed to be in town. If he was, I would have known. As I thought it through, I had an idea. Alan, one of my golf buddies, worked as an assistant manager at the Sheraton. Maybe he could help. The next day, I called him and went to the hotel to meet him during my lunch break. I explained my suspicions and asked if he could check whether Larry had stayed at the hotel in the past 6 months, and if so, when. He said he could find that out, but it would take about a day to access the records. By the end of the next day, Friday, he provided the information I had requested. I had been hoping that Larry wouldn't appear as a guest, but my hopes were not realized. Larry had stayed 3 times for 1 night each in the past few months. He gave me the dates, then added, "Ron, I also need to tell you that he has a reservation here for next Tuesday night." A chill ran through me as various thoughts flooded my mind. I then asked, "Alan, would it be possible to ensure he's put in a room where I can set up a camera?" He hesitated for a moment before responding, "Hey, buddy, that would be illegal." "I can't do that." A pause. "But I don't know how you came up with this idea, but if you were to reserve a specific room for the day before and the day after his stay, and somehow he ended up in that room, and somehow you forgot to take the cameras with you." I immediately caught on. "Thanks, Alan. How would you like me to make the reservations so there won't be any issues?" He told me to just call the hotel and book the room, and he would handle the room assignments. Later, when I checked the dates against the phone calls and Larry's stays, I found that the first calls were about a month after the reunion and about 10 days before Larry's arrival. I hadn't noticed anything unusual at that time. The second set of calls occurred about a week before our friend's visit, and Larry's stay had been on that same day. The third set, of course, was just a week ago, and Larry was due in a few days. When I got home after my revelations, acting normally became impossible. I wasn't feeling normal. My stomach ached more than ever before. I ate very little, and naturally, Cindy noticed. She waited until the kids were asleep, then approached and tried to sit on my lap. I turned her down. "Honey, what's wrong? I can see you're really troubled by something. Can you talk to me about it? Maybe I can help." I didn't want to discuss it, but I knew she wouldn't let it go. So I decided to take the bait. "It's nothing. Just some past memories I'd rather not think about." "Like what?" "Don't worry about it. I'll be fine." "Ron, don't shut me out. Let's lay everything out and handle it, whatever it is." After a pause, I continued, "All right." Pause. "Well, Jerry called today. He tried to keep it casual like a normal social call, but, pause and deep breath as we talked, he became serious and finally expressed his concern about what happened in Washington. He, almost whispering, just wanted to make sure everything was okay between us." She turned pale. It reminded me of that jerk Larry, and those memories are still unpleasant and upsetting. She began to say something, then stopped. With tears welling up, she said, "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. When it happened, I had no idea it would hurt you. You know I love you, and the last thing I ever want to do is hurt you." Then she broke down in tears and excused herself to the bathroom. I wasn't sure if she was genuinely sorry, or if I had just touched a guilty nerve. I didn't feel any better or gain any new insights. I just felt sick. Had I built a case based on circumstances that were actually unrelated? I couldn't honestly believe that. Should I confront her now? If she was having an affair, what would confronting her accomplish? In the end, I decided to wait it out until after Tuesday. I made the reservations and then did my best to survive one of the toughest weekends of my life. I kept reassuring myself that I had no solid evidence and that my assumptions might be incorrect. However, this didn't alleviate my distress. I felt completely miserable. The situation was worsened by the children, who quickly sensed that something was wrong with their father and wanted to know what was happening. Naturally, I couldn't provide them with a satisfactory explanation. Adding to the difficulty was Cindy, who knew what the issue was and continuously tried to comfort me by expressing her love and apologizing for not understanding my perspective on our agreement at that time. The only solace I found was that during several of her attempts to make amends, I thought to myself, if my suspicions are correct, maybe seeing how much the Larry incident has hurt me will make her reconsider and cancel her plans with him. Of course, if my suspicions were unfounded, I would have endured unnecessary grief and torment. Unfortunately, my terrible suspicions persisted stubbornly. Monday was unbearable. In the afternoon, I took some rented surveillance equipment to the hotel, checked in, and set up the devices. Dinner was even more difficult than usual. Cindy quickly took the children aside and then confronted me with everything she had, trying to convince me of her remorse for what she had done, reassure me of her love, and attempt to get me to bed to show her affection. She pushed the issue to the point where I almost confronted her. Just before I did, she changed her approach. With her hands on her hips and showing signs of irritation, she said, "Damn it, Ron. This has gone beyond the point of reason. You're making a big deal out of a misunderstanding whose consequences aren't worth discussing. I made a mistake and slept with someone else. My biggest error was doing it with someone you knew, and you can't imagine how sorry I am for that betrayal. Yes, that was my foolish fault. But how long am I going to have to apologize for one stupid mistake? I hope our marriage is strong enough to withstand the little errors that either of us might make." With that, she broke down and mumbled in a weak voice, "I'm saying it for the last time. I'm sorry. Now I'm going to bed." I wanted to approach her, but I simply couldn't bring myself to do it. By morning, I managed to adopt a false front and appear somewhat better than I had over the past few days. Before leaving, I resolved to attempt one final measure in hopes of finding some relief. As I was putting on my coat to depart, I said, "Honey, I don't anticipate things being too busy at the office, so as soon as I can clear my desk, I'll head home. We can go out for lunch and have a conversation." She turned pale, and I believe her legs gave way. "Oh, sweetie, I have a braces adjustment appointment this morning. You know how it is. There's no telling how long it might take. Could you come home early this afternoon?" You hadn't mentioned a visit to the orthodontist before. Sweetie, with everything that's been happening these last few days, Dr. Schmidt wasn't on my mind. Normally I would call to cancel, but my mouth is hurting, and I need the adjustment. Can't we meet this afternoon? No, I'm sorry, but I have a meeting shortly after lunch. I don't know how long it will go on. At that moment, I could no longer conceal my emotions. I knew she noticed, but she looked away and said, "I'm sorry, sweetie. Maybe after the kids are in bed." I remained silent, gave her a quick kiss on the cheek, and left. Going to work felt pointless. I wasn't doing anything meaningful. I thought about going to the hotel to confront them, but decided against it, knowing that if I caught them, my anger might lead me to harm one or both of them. I called during lunch and was slightly surprised when she answered. I noticed she seemed a bit annoyed about something. If she knew I was busy, why hadn't she spent more time with the other man? Then it clicked. Checkout is at 11. I informed her I would be late and not wait for dinner. Around mid-afternoon, I checked into the hotel and went to my room. Thankfully, it had been tidied up. I would have felt physically ill if the morning's remnants were still there. As I was removing the cameras, there was a knock on the door. Through the peephole, I saw Alan. I opened the door and let him in. "Hi, Alan. Thanks for your help." "You're welcome. I'm sorry about all this. I hadn't seen her before, but today I did see Cindy come in. Thanks for the information. With what I believe I have here, the two of us are done. I thought you should know that Larry got really angry with me this morning." "How so?" "Well, not long after your wife arrived, he called the front desk wanting to extend his stay for another day. My clerk passed the request to me when Larry started becoming abusive. He was furious because he would have to switch rooms. I told him this room had been specifically requested and we couldn't change it. Eventually, he accepted another room. When I offered to send a bellhop to help him move, he immediately declined, saying he could handle it himself. I asked if he had seen them leave, and he replied that Cindy departed around 4. Larry had also left, but he wasn't sure when. It was after Cindy. I was confused. How had Cindy managed to come and go so quickly? It didn't take much to figure out. She had used call forwarding. There would be no record of the afternoon's events, but so what? I didn't need it. As I finished dismantling the equipment, I was conflicted about watching the videos. I had informed Cindy that I wouldn't be home for dinner because I intended to review the footage. Now I was uncertain if I wanted to watch them at that moment. I needed to contemplate my next steps. If the recordings confirmed my suspicions, or rather what I truly knew, I would have to hire a lawyer. There was no way to justify her actions or reconcile our relationship. Conversely, if the tapes revealed nothing, it would be utterly ridiculous, and I would need to clarify a few things and steer us back on track. However, I couldn't bring myself to view them right then. I called Cindy, canceled my plans, and told her I would be home for dinner. Perhaps I could sense something from her. During my drive home, a memory from the past surfaced. The Monday following the reunion, Cindy had finally agreed to get a checkup. That evening, she informed me that her tests came back negative. Wait a second. They usually don't have results on the same day. I never saw any documentation, only took her word for it. I contacted the doctor's office and discovered that she hadn't been there at all. Her last appointment was her annual physical about 8 months prior. Luckily, when I arrived home, I found that the kids were staying over at friends' houses. The next day was a work day for teachers, and there was no school. I decided to take things easy. How was your day? It was fine. Nothing out of the ordinary except not having the kids tonight. We chatted about general matters while preparing dinner. As we ate, she finally glanced over and asked if I was making progress with my issue. No, I can't say that I am. You're not doing much to help the situation. She looked startled and asked me to clarify. Why did you lie to me? I responded irritably, What the hell are you talking about? When we returned from the reunion, why did you deceive me about getting tested for STDs? Her irritation flared and she sputtered, What are you talking about? Her quick shift to anger indicated that I was touching on sensitive areas, nerves that were barely concealed and recently uncovered. All right, Cindy, let's get serious. I spoke with the doctor's office today and you haven't been there in 8 months. In other words, you deceived me. Damn it. I won't tolerate your immature jealousy over Larry anymore. Yes, I made a mistake, and I've acknowledged that. But you won't intimidate me. Your demand that I undergo a checkup was completely unwarranted and baseless. It was merely your childish attempt to punish me and express your anger towards Larry. I'm sorry I lied, but you left me no choice. If you can't move past this Larry issue, you should seek some form of counseling. She began to storm out loudly. Wait a minute, lady. Either you sit down and talk with me, or we need to think about ending this marriage. My comment about termination got her to sit down. I have a crucial question. Why did you decline the checkup and then lie about it? I believe the answer lies in a more significant and serious question. Whose word are you going to trust? Larry's or mine? On the surface, it seems like you should believe Larry. And why Larry's? I'm sorry, but the only explanation that comes to my mind is that he is attractive, pleasant to talk to, and has a good dignity. She sprang up and yelled, There it is. Your uncontrollable jealousy of him. He's not the person you're making him out to be. He's always been nice to me. Always nice to you? What do you mean by always? After hesitating for a moment, she replied, You know what I mean. When I was with him at the reunion, he was very kind. Well, I'm not going to argue with you. It's time to take action or stop. Our intimate life is on hold until you get a checkup. The way he behaved behind my back at the reunion indicates to me that he is still that sneaky guy who was kicked out of the Corps for inappropriate behavior in the intimate sphere. I wonder how many times he's been treated since then, and even more. I wonder how he's avoided disease all this time. Believe me, Cindy, what I'm saying isn't about jealousy. It's about the health and well-being of my family. If that doesn't matter to you, then it's really time to consider going separate ways. She sat down, tears streaming down her face. I could tell she was distressed. Finally, in a voice just above a whisper, she said, I'm sorry, honey. I understand your intentions, but I still think you're wrong about Larry. I'll see the doctor tomorrow. She came over, kissed me on the cheek, and headed to the bedroom. Over her shoulder, she asked, Are you coming? Not now. I brought some work home that I need to look at. I sat for a moment, having just decided that I couldn't delay watching the videos any longer. Taking my briefcase, I went into the office, closed the door, retrieved the videos, put on the headset, and began what I feared would be an agonizing task. I wasn't worried about Cindy walking in on me. There's a built-in warning system with several squeaky boards in the hallway. Unless you jump about 6 feet to approach the office, you can't avoid them. Around midnight, I had a sudden recollection. I grabbed my cell phone and dialed our home number. As I had feared, she hadn't disabled call forwarding. I could hear her cell phone ringing in the kitchen. Instead of hanging up, I let it continue ringing. After a short while, I heard footsteps in the hallway and down the stairs, and Cindy quietly muttered, "Oh no." She greeted me a few times before hanging up. I swiftly got up, approached the door, and as she reached the top of the stairs, I asked, "Is everything okay?" "Yes. Some idiot called my cell phone at this hour and then wouldn't answer. Probably drunk. Good night, sweetie. You coming soon?" "In a while." If it weren't for the audio portion, I wouldn't have watched all the recordings. I cried a lot and felt an overwhelming urge to lash out. In the video, it was clear she was deeply involved with someone else. They were acting without a care for any boundaries or the promises we had made to each other. The audio was bittersweet. Most of it was just small talk and whispers that seemed to mock everything we had. The worst part was realizing how she seemed to accept all the nonsense he was offering. His lines were so absurd they wouldn't even fit in a B-movie. How could she be so naive? At the end of the recording, a conversation with Alan was captured, and Larry gave Cindy a room number, telling her to follow him in about 5 minutes. The rest of the recording showed the housekeepers and an empty room. I didn't finish until almost 3 in the morning and didn't even attempt to go to bed. I went to the den to watch TV and must have dozed off around 5. The next thing I knew, the alarm was sounding, and moments later, Cindy was there asking why I hadn't come to bed. I told her the truth. I was sick. She tried to get me to go to bed, but I insisted I needed to work. I needed someone to talk to, so I called Jerry and vented to him. She called me shortly after 8 and said she had a doctor's appointment at 10. By then, I didn't care if she went for the checkup. Around 11:30, she showed up at my office, smiling and full of energy. "There, I've taken care of the silly old test. They're expediting the work and we'll have the results by late tomorrow afternoon. I told them you would pick up the results tomorrow. Now, does that make you happier, and will you take me out to lunch?" I simply nodded and took her out to eat. I struggled to keep myself composed during the meal. It hurt to realize our marriage was over. When she came into my office, I had barely managed to beat her there as I had just returned from the attorney's office to initiate the divorce process. The actual paperwork would take several days, and I couldn't wait that long to inform her of what was happening. The attorney suggested I give her a letter of intent to officially notify her of the impending divorce. It would be ready the next day. Seeing her now was just plain heartbreaking. After a harrowing night of anguish, I navigated my workday with mechanical precision. Just before lunch, the attorney's secretary called to inform me that the letter was ready. Since it was nearby, I went to collect it. I nearly hesitated to take the envelope and found myself crying on the way back to the office. The lab results became available after 3 o'clock, and I left work immediately upon hearing the news. I was taken aback when I inquired about Cindy's test results, and the nurse responded that the doctor would arrive shortly to discuss them. My shock deepened when the doctor appeared and led me into his office. After exchanging brief pleasantries, he hit me with his first question. "Mr. Alren, when was the last time you had intimacy with your wife?" I won't recount the entire conversation, but Cindy had tested positive for disease. I collapsed and was unconscious for nearly an hour. During our subsequent discussion, I explained the situation, and we concluded that her infection was relatively recent, certainly not old enough for her last encounter with Larry. This gave me some relief, as I was fairly certain she hadn't transmitted it to me. Nevertheless, I decided to get tested myself. Once I was done, I had to call a co-worker to pick me up since I was unfit to drive. He offered to take me home, but I insisted on returning to my office. I sat there quietly, reflecting on everything, occasionally crying. When it was time to leave, my friend drove me back to retrieve my car. I was in complete turmoil, feeling deep despair, sorrow, anger, and even contemplating Day. Instead of going home, I headed to a nearby bar. I didn't intend to drink, and I didn't. I just needed more time alone. Around 6 o'clock, my cell phone rang. It was Cindy, and I knew she was trying to find out where I was. At that moment, I didn't care and turned off the phone, continuing my usual distressed conversations with the bartender. He couldn't offer much help, but it helped me regain some control. By 11, I made my way home. It was just a house now, no longer a home. Earlier that evening, I had called my parents and asked them to look after the kids for a while. I would bring them tomorrow and explain everything when I arrived. Cindy heard the garage door open and came running into the garage, crying and asking where I had been and how worried she had been. She tried to embrace and kiss me, but I pushed her away. I told her to stop crying and meet me in the rec room basement. I would be there shortly. I followed her inside and closed as many doors as I could to avoid waking the kids. Then I went to the rec room, shutting the door behind me. Ron, what's wrong? What's happening? You're scaring me." I didn't recognize my own voice. I simply took out the lab report and threw it onto the table in front of her. She glanced at it, and I saw the panic and fear set in. Trembling, she reached for it. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing, and then she let out a muffled scream. "Ron, this must be a mistake. The lab must have mixed something up." She began to speak further when I forcefully interrupted. "I told you what could happen if you got involved with that slimy guy. He's dirty again, and now, so are you." She was taken aback and replied in a somewhat subdued voice, "What are you talking about?" I couldn't hold back my frustration any longer. "Let me be clear. You were with him all day on Tuesday, and now there are serious consequences to consider. But Ron, I haven't seen—" "Please stop with the lies. How can you claim to care for me while putting our family at risk? I don't want to hear the word love from you ever again." Almost shouting, "Ron, you're wrong, I didn't." In a moment of anger, I turned away from her words. I needed her to understand the seriousness of the situation. "You'll receive papers in the next few days," I said, tossing the letter at her. "Once you collect yourself, pack what you need and find a place to stay. In the morning, I'm taking the kids to my parents. By the time I return on Sunday, you need to have found somewhere to go. There are funds in the checking account, but I've made adjustments that will limit your access." "Oh, Ron, the kids. I can't leave without saying goodbye. You won't see them right now." Her eyes filled with fear, realizing the impact this had on everyone involved. "Cindy, I don't know where you can go, and I can't be concerned with that now." I turned and walked upstairs, leaving her to process everything. I had never spoken to anyone this way before. As I reached the kitchen, I felt the wave of emotion shift. The anger was still present, but starting to dull. About 45 minutes later, I heard the sound of the garage door. For your information, I had the kids tested, and we all received negative results. 11 years plus, Larry spent his final weeks in a hospital, struggling with severe illness. The night before he was set to be transferred to a rehabilitation center, he received a visitor. Larry's face lit up as he said, "It's so good to see you. This place is so lonely." The visitor approached quietly. Larry's expression shifted suddenly and he cried out, "No! No!" before everything went silent. Cindy faced trial where character references and details about Larry's personality were brought to light. With this support, the charges were reduced, and she was convicted of second-degree manslaughter. She received a 20-year sentence, with the possibility of parole after 10 years, making her eligible for release soon. During her final years in prison, Cindy's health deteriorated due to illness. One question that remained unanswered was how she managed to find herself in that situation. Despite her past, no one could fully explain the events leading up to that night. 5 years ago, I met and married Marlene, who has been a source of light and strength for our family. Interestingly, it was Cindy's situation that made me appreciate life differently. You might wonder why Cindy remained a part of our story. Marlene, understanding what had happened, believed Cindy deserved compassion. She convinced me that we should visit Cindy in prison. Over time, our visits helped Cindy express her remorse and allowed us to heal from the past. Marlene's unwavering support played a significant role in putting an end to the pain and resentment. Cindy, in those meetings, avoided seeing the children, saying, "I want them to remember me as the mother I was." About a year ago, as her illness worsened, she shared with us, "I have regrets about that night, but the most important thing is making peace with it now." Our last visit with Cindy was about a month ago. She was visibly frail but expressed gratitude for the love and support we shared. Her final message left us emotional. "Please take care of the children. I love you all, and extend my thanks to your friends for their unwavering support. I wish I had listened sooner. Semper Fi, buddy."